Welcome to the Massachusetts School of Law Educational Forum. The topic for today's show is violence against women, why courts can't stop it, and why women tolerate it. Before I introduce the guests, let's review some of the reported statistics. In an average 12-month period, as many as 4 million women receive severe or life-threatening injuries inflicted by a male partner. Many times the injuries are fatal. The number of women who have been murdered by their partners is greater than the number of soldiers killed in the Vietnam War. About a third of all female homicide victims over the age of 14 were killed by an intimate male partner. Spousal abuse occurs at least once in nearly half of all American marriages. Query: who are these men that batter? Why don't abused women reach out for help? What are the effects of battering relationships on children? How should a woman leave an abuser? Are courts responsive to the problems of domestic violence? Stay tuned for the answers. Joining me today is Susan Murphy-Milano, a former investment banker, is now the executive director of the Chicago-based Project Protect, a nonprofit agency dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and their children. She is the author of Defending Our Lives, in which she tells her own story of growing up in a violent household. Her story provides real insight into the impact of domestic violence on children. Susan's alcoholic father, a respected police officer, continually abused and finally murdered her mother, and then killed himself. Susan, thank you for being here. Anthony Capani has been a practicing trial attorney in the Merrimack Valley for 17 years. He presently has an office in Methuen, Massachusetts, and is a professor at the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover. Professor Capani teaches family law and trial skills courses. Welcome, Tony.
Good afternoon.
Jackie McEvely, the executive director of the Battered Women's Resources Incorporated of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, has worked in the human services field for 9 years. Delighted you're here, Jackie.
Thank you, Diane.
George Wattendon is a prosecutor and legal advisor to the Dover, New Hampshire Police Department and is the author of articles appearing in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin and the New Hampshire Bar Journal, instructing how to prosecute domestic violence cases without victim cooperation. Thank you for joining us, George.
Well,
And I'm Diane Sullivan, an attorney and professor at the Massachusetts School of Law. Let's begin by looking at predictors of domestic violence. Jackie, who are the men that batter?
There is no basic stereotype for men who batter. I would say the most common characteristics is that a person who batters, whether it be male or female, a majority of them being men, are power and control. They are of all ethnic backgrounds, all socioeconomic backgrounds. Doesn't matter if you're tall or short or white or Asian or African American. It's all about power and control.
Let me ask you this, though. Are children that grow up in an abusive type home where they've been abused as children, for example, more likely to become wife beaters or child beaters or both?
I would say yes, because young children like to respect their mothers and their fathers, and so they see their parents initially disrespecting their mother, hitting them, abusing them verbally, physically, and they're more likely to become abusive.
So do you think that abusiveness is some type of copied behavior?
In some essence, yes, yes.
George, what are your views on this?
yeah, I agree with Jackie that there's no one type of abuser. They come in all ages, all sizes, all different economic classes.
So in your experience, you've not seen any common characteristics like problems with alcohol, problems with drugs, unemployment?
No, you see a host of those things. So it's difficult to pinpoint one factor that causes it.
I would like to add to George is that, you know, you had mentioned unemployment, and someone who may be unemployed or someone who could be an attorney, a police officer like Susan's dad, someone who could be a minister. It doesn't matter how much money you have or how much money you don't have or what your educational background is. The person could be a batter. You don't know who you're going to come up against.
Okay. Susan, do you believe there are any signs that occur before actual abuse that are clues to potential abuse?
I think you need to look, if I may, at the role models, the parents, anybody watching right now. Their role models, these children's role models are setting an example. Their whole warm, world, safe place that they live in, their environment that they spend every day in with these people who are supposed to teach them, are acting out in ways that the children don't understand. They don't understand that they can go to the teacher. They don't understand that they can talk to another relative. Many times people don't want to believe, who are watching right now, that it's somebody that they know very well who's capable of this. They think that maybe she's had a bad day. She's making too much of it. Maybe it's that time of the month. It's excuses after excuse. And they blame her. And they say, well, listen, go back. Just try one more time. How bad can it be? For the kids, for the family. That could get her killed. And you show to the children that that's okay, that then they're going to tolerate that, and they grow up into teenage relationships, because 40% of all relationships across the country are with teenagers who are now in violent situations, who are getting killed at rapid rates.
Wow. Susan, I want to come back in just a few minutes and explore the impact of domestic violence on children at greater depth. But before we do that, one last question I have in this topic. Is the abuser, do you believe, desperately fearful that his wife or his girlfriend is going to abandon him, so therefore he beats her into submission, if you will, in an attempt to control her?
He feels he owns her. He feels that that's her property, just like the car to the title to the car, the house, that's mine. I chose you, therefore you are mine. I will get rid of you when I say, not when you say. Till death do us part can literally mean that, till death do us part.
Has that been your experience, Jackie?
Yes, I'd like to add that oftentimes the batterer will say, well, if I can't have you, no one else will have you. I will kill you, and I will kill your children and anyone else who comes in our way of breaking us up.
Tony, even though this is not necessarily your area of expertise, what's your reaction to this? Does it surprise you?
It surprised me in what regard, Diane?
That there's no typical profile of men who batter?
Absolutely, it does not surprise me. If we could predict that, we would have a beginning solution to this problem. But as has been stated, I'm in total agreement. I don't think you can predict or compile a stereotype of a person who batters. And I would think there are a number of women out there who batter men, and you couldn't come up with a profile for those individuals either.
And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Let's change topics, though, and let's talk about the popular misconception in this particular area. And I guess my first question is, many people believe that women who get battered enjoy their beatings in some way, so that they purposely provoke their husbands or their boyfriends into violent behavior. Is there any truth whatsoever to this?
No, it's a reflection. They feel, the women feel that it's a reflection in the relationship of them. They try one more time. They're doing it because there's children, because there's family, because he says he loves her. When they started that relationship, that's the most sacred thing you can do. We don't teach safe relationship behaviors. We don't teach people to check out the person that we're going to be with and spend the rest of our lives with. And yet you're not going to get a job unless the employer checks you out. You're not going to be able to get credit at a bank unless you're checked out. We don't know. They're Jekyll and Hyde. They manipulate the relationship and the situation, the offender or the person who's doing the abuse, until they get what they want. And then you're in their control. They know you. They know what buttons to push. They know how to tell you what to do, what not to do. You love them. They love you. And that is very sacred, especially in today's day and age.
Jackie?
Yeah, I would have to agree. You know, there's no signs. You know, you can't go to a grocery shop and test it out like you test a car. You can't say, okay, well, I'm going to give this one back. You know, until death do us part means till death do us part in some cases, and no.
George, in your experience as a prosecutor, have you seen situations in which the wife or the girlfriend, in your opinion, purposely are provoking their partner into violent behavior?
Well, they may be provoking, but they're not doing it deliberately. I've handled several cases where both parties were intoxicated when the assault occurred, and there may have been some verbal and/or physical conduct by the victim that preceded the assault. So that's possible.
But let me ask you this. If the husband and wife are, we'll say, partially drunk, and the wife starts name-calling or saying, for example, that she's been involved with the best friend of her husband, or some way starts shoving him, and then the husband responds with a more severe shove, and there ends up to be an injury, would you prosecute the husband?
Yes, most likely the police would make the arrest on the person who's used the excessive force. So in that case scenario which you gave for an example, if the push resulted in some type of an injury that the police could observe, they would arrest the male perpetrator in that case for using excessive force. Because, excuse me, even though there's there's a pushing, that doesn't justify punching somebody or kicking them or choking them, is what usually happens. They retaliate way too excessively, and that's where they get arrested.
But I guess my question is, do the police, do the prosecutors, or do the judges, in your experience, ever consider the conduct of the wife or the woman that caused her ultimate beating or injury?
Do they consider it?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I think that is going to come into consideration with a jury or a judge.
Should they consider it?
Well, I don't think you can keep that from them. That's part of what's happened, and you can't keep facts from going before the court. I'm sure, as Tony will tell you. But as long as the jurors know the law, and they have to realize that merely pushing someone does not justify that person striking you back with a fist, and they have to understand that self-defense, you can only use a reasonable amount of force to defend yourself. So in that example, perhaps if he restrained the person rather than punching them, he would have been okay under self-defense laws if he had merely restrained them. But I think what happens is they just anger, alcohol, those kinds of things, they just retaliate far too excessively.
So if the husband comes home and his wife says, who's partially drunk, I'm leaving you, I've been sleeping with your best friends for 5 years, starts throwing her keys across the room at him, doesn't hit him, and he turns around and swings.
Well, verbal provocation alone does not justify any force.
And so it's not considered by your office or the bench ultimately.
Well, that's hard to say. I think Tony maybe can, a jury is going to take that into consideration. Would you agree if you've got a contested case?
I think it would go in the form of mitigation as regards to sentencing, but I don't know whether or not it would constitute a valid defense to the crime. As George indicated, if somebody verbally threatens or verbally upsets his spouse and the reaction is physical violence, I think you would be hard-pressed to raise that as a valid defense. I think it would go more in the area of sentencing, what will happen in this case.
Susan, changing topics a little bit, don't women have some responsibility if they stay with men who abuse them?
We have responsibility to teach people how to be parents and teach people how to be citizens long before they become adults, and we don't do that. We have a power base, and we solve our differences. We're driving down the street, and somebody cuts us off. What do any of us do? We put up our finger, we chase them, we confront them, they've cut us off. That's how we solve everything. It's got to go back to the basics, and we've long forgotten that. Instead of pointing fingers or instead of saying, let's separate this, when you say the word domestic violence, you automatically think of the woman. Domestic, house, home. There's more than one person that perpetrated this. And it affects a family. It doesn't affect one person. It affects a community, a neighborhood. When that tragedy happens or that crime takes place, we pay for it when the police respond and the criminal justice system respond. We don't get involved because we don't think it's our problem. We send our children down the street to the neighbor's house to play with a child who's the same age as our child because they need a playmate. Do we know anything about our neighbors anymore? No. Do we have respect and accountability for ourselves? No. So these women in these situations, they're all part of society's nonsense, of society's non-accountability for safety, for respect, for their own lives.
Jackie, let me ask you this. Does a woman's decision to leave, to continue, or to stay with an abuser hinge on the needs of her children?
Oftentimes it does. The woman that we see coming into our agency for counseling or for confidential sheltering, the last thing that they'll say is, I took all the abuse until it was perpetrated upon my child, and then, then she'll leave. But she'll take all the abuse, she'll suffer all the verbal, the physical, but once it hits the children, that's usually the stopping ground for most of the women that we see.
And I think it's important, if I can add, that people think that a shelter is a dirty, terrible place. It is not. The programs and the services that they provide are there for a healthy, better environment. And they're clean, and they're safe, and they're confidential. People have a misconception about that, and I think that's pretty important.
Susan, you started to talk about this a little bit. Why don't women leave their abusers? Do they feel ashamed? Do they misperceive the danger?
It's anyone who chose that person. It's a reflection of them. When my father killed my mother, I had taken it upon myself to feel bad. I took it as a reflection of me because this happened in my family. Somehow people were going to look at me funny. that I did something wrong, that I couldn't stop it. We take that on ourselves. We think that we're not good enough. We think that nobody else will love us or want us. It's like a prisoner of war. It's like being worked on mentally over and over. You wonder why somebody stays when somebody who's abusive says you're not good enough for anybody else. You're not good enough to go to work. You're not good enough to clean the house. You're not good enough to take care of the children. Well, do we stop and say, what are you doing with me? No. We don't look at it like that because we love that person. That person made a commitment to us. And when it doesn't work, we have to be accountable to everybody else. We often don't love ourselves enough. We're not taught to love ourselves enough as individuals first. We think that we need to seek somebody else's approval and love in order for us to be who we are, when we should know who we are prior to that.
George, are women perpetrators as well as victims of domestic violence?
Yes, I would say they're certainly in the minority, but we do have occasions to arrest women.
And prosecute them for
yes.
domestic violence abuse?
Yes.
What would you say would be the percentage of domestic violence cases that you handle that are women as the perpetrators as opposed to men?
Less than 10%.
Less than 10%.
Diane, if I could just caution using statistics, I would think that if there was a male that was being abused by his spouse, he would be extremely reluctant to go into court and stand in an open courtroom and say, I'm fearful of my wife, she's abusing me. Not that that doesn't happen, but it has a real chilling effect. So I don't think you can rely on any statistics in regards to that area, because there's got to be a number of unreported abuse cases dealing with women abusing men. Not that I'm saying that that's a large percentage in comparison to women who are abused by men, but I still think that I would be careful examining any statistics in that area.
Do you think that men are physically abused, or is it more verbal abuse? Tony?
And again, that's hard to say. Myself, the experience I've had with the very limited number of men who wanted to pursue a restraining order against their wife is really minuscule. The ones that I did bring forward encompassed physical abuse. And I think in the situation that we brought forward is my client was extremely worried that his wife was going to bring a restraining order against him, and that precipitated him bringing the action. But you know, it's just really hard to predict.
Diane, I'd just like to add that we get very few calls from men who are victims of domestic abuse. We probably get 5 on an average a year, which isn't a lot compared to the number of calls we get from females. And I agree with Tony that statistics are so ever-changing rapidly that it's very hard to determine what that ratio is. But you know, we also have to look at the gay and lesbian community as well, and someone who may be in a homosexual relationship are still a little fearful about coming out and talking about domestic violence in that relationship as well. So I think you have to look at the whole picture.
You know, Jackie raises a very interesting point. One of the cases that I was speaking to a judge concerning domestic abuse a number of years ago involved a relationship with 2 women who were roommates, and they were lovers also. And usually it's very easy for law enforcement and judges alike when they receive a call on the weekend by the police saying we have a domestic situation here, Judge. Usually a judge can make a very good decision. He'll say the husband is thrown out of the house and they can appear in court the next day or after 10 days depending on the situation. Well, in this case, the judge was relating to me. He had a call from the police officer, and now there are 2 women, each accusing the other of being abusive physically. And interesting, what the judge did in that case is he threw the both of them out of the house and said they can go into court the next day and discuss their situation before the judge. But I think if that were a situation with a male and a female, the presumption would be that male would be out of the house. And it's going to be interesting to see with the ever-changing relationships and eventually if there's homosexual marriages, how the courts are going to deal with that. It's going to be a much more complicated issue and not just based on gender. And it's going to be interesting to see what occurs.
If it is a heterosexual relationship and there are no children involved, do you think that would be a fairer solution to say both people are out of the house?
I don't think that's necessarily fairer. I think there's economics involved. I think the situation I have, well, the difficulty I have in this area is this. I think unquestionably everyone is in agreement. When there is evidence of abuse, I think every mechanism that we can employ to resolve that should be used. I think the problem arises is that it's an invisible crime in that there is only the husband and the wife present, or the household members present. Oftentimes there's not corroborating evidence, and you cannot get corroborating evidence because there's no one else around. If there is physical evidence or there's a history of abuse, that makes it easier. What makes it difficult is when you have a situation where you have a gentleman who has a career, who has a reputation in the community, and you have a wife that has an equally a good reputation in the community, and they're alleging there's an abusive situation there. Now, if there's no corroborating evidence, there's no physical abuse, it's very difficult. Sometimes it becomes one word against the other, and most of the judges I know will always err in the favor of the woman in that case.
That been your experience, George?
Yeah, of course, we're dealing, in my experience, with the criminal justice system. So when the police respond, they're looking for physical evidence to corroborate that, or witnesses, or an admission from the parties. So they're looking for something concrete, as opposed to the civil system, where all you need to do to go into court to get a protection order is an allegation, really. But police are looking for that concrete evidence, and they will document it and then make an arrest if they have probable cause. So we usually have that physical evidence that Tony's talking about.
But what happens usually is that the police do not respond. There's an incident that occurred the evening before. The wife or the woman in this case will go into court, and she'll appear before the judge pro se, or with the assistance from whatever groups, but it will be ex parte. The husband will not be there. She will appear before the judge and just articulate that she's afraid of her husband, or allege that her husband was abusive or threatened her, and she will be granted a restraining order which will end in 10 days. And the husband at that time will be ordered out of the house for that 10-day period.
The police officer will arrive at his place of employment and say, you got to go.
Well, serve him with the restraining order.
And is that fair?
Well, it's been held to be constitutional in that this 10-day period, first in Massachusetts, a husband, and I think in most states, you can petition the court to get an earlier hearing than the 10-day period. So you could go in 2 days, 3 days later, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. I find from my experience, and George and I have had this discussion, once that initial restraining order issues, if there is corroborating evidence, I don't think anyone is in disagreement that, you know, that restraining order should issue, and whatever consequences the husband whatever consequences entail, the husband should experience. The problem that we have in this area is those areas that are uncorroborated, where sometimes a spouse can obtain a tactical advantage in obtaining a divorce. And this is an area where the abuse statute is being abused. A woman may not have the grounds to have her husband vacate the home. She goes to the district court, obtains a restraining order. The husband is automatically out of the house for 10 days. Most judges I know are reluctant not to extend that order for up to a year. And it's unfair to the judge. I'm not criticizing judges, but here they are. They have a hearing that's not going to last a very long period of time. They have a number of these cases waiting to be heard. And if they're going to err, they're going to err on the side of caution, and that restraining order will issue unless there really is no evidence whatsoever. I mean, there's very few cases statistically that I don't think that initial restraining order, when it's issued, doesn't extend for a period of time.
Changing topics once again, Susan, what are the effects of battering relationships on children?
They act out in the playground. They act out in other relationships. They act out when they get into situations. They become gang members, power and control. They see somebody doing it at home, so they're going to carry that out into the community, and they're going to carry that out onto public citizens and to the girls that they date and their situations in everyday life, because they saw that it was okay. As a child, I gave the best black guy in my Girl Scout uniform because I saw that as a way of common behavior every day. We were taught how to defend ourselves. My brother couldn't fight very well, so My father would use me as a sparring partner, and we would, you know, box.
At this time, I'd like to move my chair over a little. But if I could just comment, interestingly, there was a case where a 9-year-old and an 8-year-old had a mock wedding in a playground. Are you familiar with that, Susan? Yes. And the girl said to the boy, "I'm divorcing you," and he hit her in retaliation to that. And the parents went in and got an abuse order or restraining order against this little boy. Are you familiar with that, Susan? And what are your thoughts?
I think that we've carried certain things too far. First of all, we don't have a crime reporting category for domestic violence and stalking-related crimes that has a national total. We have different components and different figures all over the country. We don't have one single figure that really is accurate. We know more women die every year. We know more people are affected each year by domestic violence, but we don't know how many men are abused. We don't know how many children have injuries and lose their lives as a result of the domestic violence, because in rural areas of a Boston or of a Chicago or New York, that law enforcement or that community is less likely to report those incidences as they would in a big city. There's not the accountability. So a woman and her children don't have the same accessibility to law enforcement and the same rights as you would if you were driving drunk. We are very, very tough on drunk drivers. We have people stop you for 20 minutes on the expressway and give you your rights and take a breathalyzer test. If that information was given to a victim of violence, if she knew ahead of time what her rights were, if agencies were available to explain things at the onset, if prosecutors had the time to not be able to see the revolving door of the women and the children as they go in continuously and continuously get orders of protection trying to seek help. If there was a responsibility to the parents, both parents, to be a parent is a privilege, it's a right, it's an honor, that we're not accountable for what our children see. And it's too late when that child winds up in the criminal justice system with other gang members or committing other acts of criminal conduct. No one takes responsibility for that kid. More and more, the system is overburdened. More and more children are being tried as adults. And if you check, those children came from very dysfunctional homes. Being a dysfunctional member of a home is not an excuse for the abuse or to commit crimes. It'd be very easy for me to go commit murder. Have I done that? No. You know right from wrong, but there's no accountability for our actions. And the children, we are making them suffer. We don't have two family homes any longer. In divorce cases and domestic violence cases, I think it's wrong when either parent says mommy's bad or daddy's bad. How dare they? They have no business doing that to a child. They have no business putting that in that child's head. That child should love both parents regardless, because those two people brought that person into the world. And that child, to that child, those parents are the only people that child will know. And when the child gets old enough to make the determination, except in situations where there is excessive abuse, where there is dangerous environments, where the prosecutor steps in and where the police step in, that there needs to be precautions and there needs to be laws for parental rights. And parental rights need to be taken away when all evidence points to the fact that the offender or offenders are producing a dangerous environment to those children, which is happening at a rapid rate across the country.
What was it like for you, if you don't mind sharing with us, to see your father beat your mother?
I think it was different. I think that to look towards that, because he was the law, and because Officer Friendly came into the schools, and you would say, but that's not how this works, sir. They would look at you like you were from another planet. I was a very large child, and I would beat up the boys. I would do things thinking that was acceptable. I didn't understand why, when my father would walk out and the police would come and his white t-shirt was full of blood, why they wouldn't go in and check on her. Why she repeatedly went to the emergency room. Why no one believed us.
Did you in any way feel responsible for what was going on?
Absolutely. The career path I chose was to get her out and to get her safe. I chose, in an all-male dominated world in the early 80s, there were no women that were really doing what I was doing in the investment world. And that was a way for me to gain power and control and for me to afford my mother whatever she wanted so that she could get out. And we came up with a plan to create that. And 6 months right after they were divorced, unbeknownst to me, she had gone back to the house to sign papers, and that's when he killed her and then himself. It was something he always swore that he would do. As in the cases, though, across the country, as in the cases that Diane's agency sees. As in the cases, you know, that George sees or Tony sees in criminal civil courts, it's no different. But these women don't feel that they have a way out, or they trust enough and they go back. Had I known she had gone back, I would have stopped her. My father always felt that because I was the reason that they got married, I was the firstborn. And I always felt as a child, well, if I had cleaned my room, if I had done better in school, if I had done all these things, if, they wouldn't be going through all this. I always took the blame. So as an adult in a relationship, I was hell on wheels because, you know, if you weren't a certain height, I wore very high heels and long nails, and I was very intimidating. I didn't know what a relationship was like. And
A normal relationship.
A normal relationship. And it took probably a couple years ago until I really understood it and got assistance and really paid attention to what a relationship should and shouldn't be.
Now, you're sure older this, Sue, right? Because I'm even moving my chair further now. But if I could just interject, I think we've come a long way, probably with people like you who have been proactive in this area. I mean, there is quite a large support group out there for women who are battered now. I think the laws have been enacted to eliminate some of the problems that you probably experienced when your mother and father were going through this experience.
But the constitutionality of the challenge of the stalking laws and certain laws into effect have been a challenge from people like you, for people like me.
No, not necessarily. I just think those challenges, I mean, we want to afford everybody certain rights, due process rights, because what happens is even the best intended laws, if they're abused, they can cause as much harm as what they're trying to cure. But I see now, I mean, from my experience, I see this. If a woman is battered now, there are a number of agencies and support groups out there that are available to them. This is certainly in the public domain. Just if you take a look at the cases of notoriety in the public eye with the O.J. Simpson case, and recently here in Boston with a Red Sox player, Cadero, there's a real public awareness now of spousal abuse. Furthermore, a court now has authority in most states. Not only can they issue restraining orders, they can issue custody orders and child support payments. So to award the woman at least some financial assistance so she can make that break. And I think we're seeing
But it's difficult.
Some headway here.
Because we don't provide them with the ability and the tools to go out into the workplace, because employers will fire these women. They will not keep them there. Corporate America needs to pay attention. They have a fire alarm in their building. They have a water sprinkler system. Why don't they have a safe personnel type of a policy for people who are there, who they may not know have an order of protection, who they may not know is fleeing from their abuser? Why would they attempt to fire them and get them out of their hair? Because it's a liability to the building management, to the employees that are there. There's not a plan of action. And corporate America needs to be more involved, because these women are losing their jobs. They're forced to go back into the abusive home because they're not going to be out in the street.
I think corporate America would say, though, it's not their responsibility to take care of battered women.
It's not. They're singling out. It's their responsibility to create a safe work environment for all employees without a power base, without a power struggle, whether you're upper management or lower management. Those are valuable people. We are people. We're not things. We're not commodities. And if the offender who comes in decides to bring a nice bouquet of flowers with a Uzi underneath it and start shooting everybody, then where does the liability go? Where is the responsibility when coworkers are afraid to say something to other people because that person needs that job and could lose their job based on the fact that they're being abused?
Diane, I'd just like to add that, you know, you made the statement that it's not their responsibility. I think that's the problem. Too many people out in the community nationwide are saying it's not my responsibility. I don't know her, I don't know him, it doesn't happen in my community. Well, unfortunately it is. It's happening in every community, no matter where you live, no matter what job you have, whether you're in corporate America or you're working in, you know, a sub shop. It doesn't matter where you work, it's happening. And I think people need to start taking responsibility for their actions, and that we need to hold the batterers accountable for their actions.
Good comment, and we're going to talk more about whose responsibility is it. But before we do that, I want to talk about the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in dealing with domestic violence. George, tell me, is society and the court system, in your opinion, now responsive to the problem of domestic violence?
Well, I think we still have a long ways to go. I don't think we're anywhere near, you know, a perfect system.
But have we come far?
We have made a lot of changes. In the last probably 10 years. There's been some major changes in the laws enabling people to get restraining orders much easier than they used to be able to. They're expedited through the court system a lot quicker than they used to be. You're also seeing judges be more responsive in these cases, although not all judges, but some judges are coming around. Police have mandatory arrest policies now. Prosecutors have no dismissal policies. So you are seeing some changes. Not all judges, not all prosecutors, not all police departments, but the majority.
Diane, if I could just ask a question of George at this point. You have a no dismissal policy, and I think this is an area where I probably have a disagreement on that particular policy. And perhaps you can begin by telling us what is the purpose of having a no dismissal policy, and essentially what that means is the victim has made a decision that she does not want to go forward with these charges. And I just want to hear the underlying policy reasons.
First, a little background. Before we got to that point, we did a lot of trainings with the police department to ensure that when they went to the scene of a crime, a domestic assault, they collected and preserved the evidence when they got there. So when they make an arrest based upon probable cause, they have evidence that there's been some physical injury. They've usually gotten admission from the parties. They've talked to witnesses. So they've got some pretty strong evidence to base that probable cause on. So when they come in with an arrest, they've made a judgment that there's evidence to back that up. Now, it's a common misconception among victims that they can just drop the case once they get back together again, and that's not true. When a charge is filed by the people, on behalf of the people, it's the state that brings the charges, or the Commonwealth.
Right.
And since that's the case, it's really the prosecutor's decision to make whether or not that case goes forward. And as we've gotten more sophisticated about evidence collection and how to try these cases without the victim cooperation, we've made a decision to go forward in those cases.
And before I jump over to Tony, though, let me ask you this. Can law enforcement agencies obtain sufficient evidence to secure convictions without the assistance of a victim?
Absolutely.
And how do they do it?
Well, it's no different than a homicide case. I mean, there's not a victim in a homicide case that gets up and testifies, right? They do it through the use of circumstantial evidence.
What type of evidence?
Evidence such as what the police officer observed on the scene when they first got there, statements made by the victim while she's in an excited state, photographs of the injuries, the 911 tapes in which the victims call into the police department to summon assistance. And an example of that, I brought an example with me so we can listen to that.
Let's take a listen to the type of evidence that you might use in a court proceeding to try a case without the assistance of the victim.
But are we going to...
We're going to listen to a 911 tape, and then we're going to get both of your responses.
Emergency. Yes, my boyfriend beat me up really bad. He's threatened to kill me. I'm very afraid. He's got my 4-month-old son and my 14-year-old brother, and he's threatened to, take them away from me. Okay, is he still there with you? I took off. I escaped from the apartment. Okay, stay on the line, okay? Okay. 33, call back responding ETA 10. Do you need an ambulance, ma'am? Well, I'm okay. I got bones sticking out of my face, okay? But, I'm a third person. I'm just worried about my 4-month-old son and my brother. Okay.
I also brought a photograph with me that demonstrates what the injury looks like. And in fact, in this particular case, we sent detectives back a couple of days after the assault to ensure that we got an accurate photo of what the injury looked like. And this black eye in this photograph represents a third-day black and blue eye. And it's this kind of evidence that we're using in court to prove these cases.
Tony, you have any problems with this?
Without discussing the legalities, I just want to go to the policy behind this. And I think what happens oftentimes is we don't think through the entire problem. And from George's point of view, he's representing the state, and he wants to make sure that there's a conviction in this case. But a conviction in the case may not necessarily be the best for the victim in this case. First of all, it takes, I'm sure Susan will tell you, it takes the control away from the victim. But my perspective and my experiences, I've had a situation similar to this where the Commonwealth wanted to go forward irregardless that the victim did not want to take the case forward. The net result is the Commonwealth, not because of inadequate representation, but the Commonwealth ultimately obtained a conviction. And what that did to the husband in this case, he lost the job. He was making a very good salary at this job. It was a government job. He had access to health benefits, and what the husband needed in this case is he needed treatment. He really was emotionally unstable. He needed psychotherapy. He needed treatment. He had a support group where he worked. His employer, even though they were concerned about his actions, were willing to offer him support. They were willing to transfer him to a different section of the state to keep him away from his wife. After obtaining the conviction, he lost his job. He lost the support group that he had. Now the wife, when she looks back now, she's living in this house that was foreclosed upon, and ultimately I would think that she was worse off than she was if the Commonwealth didn't pursue the case.
But she's alive, Tony.
But I know I'm going to hear that she's alive. But there were mechanisms. Not every abuse order ends up, not everyone that has an abuse order against them intends to kill his wife. I mean, those are extreme cases. Those people who kill their spouses. My theory is this. Let me see, if I violate a restraining order and I get sent to jail for 30 days, geez, I don't think I'm going to violate it. But if I kill my wife, I'll get life imprisonment. I think those people who murder their wives, they're going to murder their wives no matter what you have in place, what mechanisms, what laws, what penalties. They are still going to commit murder. Okay? But there are other mechanisms. We talked about putting him on a bracelet so we could monitor him, transferring him. There was no indication that this would really progress into a worse situation. But I'm just using that as an isolated example, hopefully. But what happens is sometimes the Commonwealth can cause more harm to the victim than the batterer, because now the wife is out of a home. She would have received child support. She could have stayed in that home. They could have sold the house. They could have split the equity, or she could have obtained a good deal of the equity in a divorce situation. And I think this is something you have to examine. You have to look at the whole picture.
I think that is an isolated case. I don't see these cases where they typically lose their job and there's a divorce and a dissolution of the property. I mean, that typically does not occur in a first-time offender. Usually we're looking at somebody who's going to go on probation, is going to get ordered into a counseling program from 6 months to a year, and is probably going to have a suspended jail sentence. They're not going to have to go to jail. They're not going to have to lose their job. And, I mean, the whole goal of the system, as you know, is rehabilitative. So, I mean, we want that person to get through a counseling program and address the violence at the counseling program. But it's not our purpose to destroy their lives. And I think that if, in your example, if the prosecutor just looked the other way, there's no way to enforce that person would go into counseling and follow through on those things. We need to have some, control over that person, either through probation or, the court monitoring that situation to make sure that person's in compliance. So.
But, and you can only do so much in a patch. I see things across the country where there's gang members involved, where it's not just the offender, but it's the other people who are now going to come after her because she ratted on him. She got him out. Now he's in jail. They're going to take care of her. They're going to harm her. The state has to be able, in those cases, to protect her, to relocate her in an apartment. But that's not happening. And these women are losing their lives.
They don't have to have her testify in the witness stand, I mean,
but
they can get around it.
Because they don't understand it, because the offenders don't understand it, they're part of a gang. You just didn't put away one person. You went after a gang. You went after a swarm of bees in a hornet's nest, is what I'm saying. And while I agree with you to a certain extent, I don't agree with, when you look at the whole picture, find out his affiliations and his associations, find out his weaponry, his artillery, what's going on. Because those things, in my opinion, as an investigative body to go in when we go into these cases, plays a big factor. And the state, a lot of times, I'm not talking about Massachusetts, I'm talking about other places in other parts of the country. They are unwilling to provide the certain mechanisms in place to keep her safe. Because she's not up against one person, she's up against a whole gang. She's had a child by this person. Her family is scared. She's got no place to go. So in those situations, to me, those are factors.
Yeah, and I think the government has to follow through on the protection angle. If they're going to do that in that scenario where she's a gang member's girlfriend or wife, yeah, you've got to protect her.
But because of the overburdening of the system, because it's too many cases, it's too many victims, they just don't have the time to do that.
The alternative is to look the other way, and we cannot do that. We've got to hold them accountable. There's
but
got to be consequences.
But
Otherwise,
Judge, at the same
we
time,
don't get
to have,
anywhere.
To have an inflexible policy where you say there's a no dismissal policy, I think that really has to be examined closely, because there has to be some exceptions to that policy that the district attorney or the Commonwealth can make a judgment.
Like your fingerprints, no two cases are the same. They're not identical. So maybe to look at it that way and not give leniency, but just in a total picture, put the shoe on the other foot.
We haven't figured out a way to, make exceptions. I mean, because we're dealing with such a volatile area that we can't predict, if we don't prosecute this case, that this person won't get killed. We just can't do that. We're not, that sophisticated.
I think we
can't
can go in
figure
and
that
make
out.
a study of this, can't we?
Yeah,
We'll
I
have
think
some
so.
not-for-profit do a finding and give us the funds to do this?
Absolutely.
Two different sides, it would work well.
Let's direct our attention now, if we can, because we're going to quickly run out of time, to the effectiveness of restraining orders. Jackie, in your experience, do restraining orders work, or are they so routinely violated that they don't matter?
Well, I'd say yes and no to both of your questions. I think oftentimes the victims will say, it's just a piece of paper, what is it going to do? What we try to teach the women that we service through our courts up in Northwestern County is that you need to have a paper trail. You need to be on top of it. You cannot violate the restraining order themselves. Oftentimes women will say, well, I need to talk to my husband or boyfriend to get medicine for the children, or to get a loaf of bread, or whatever it may be. He has visitation. In that case, you cannot talk to that person no matter what. And oftentimes there will be a third person that will get involved, and we tell her too, you cannot do that. You need to keep a paper trail of when he is violating it, how he is violating it, and report it. It's a lot of work, and women think it's just going to stop as soon as they say it's going to stop, but it's not that easy. And are they routinely violated? Sure. By both parties, unfortunately, I would have to say. And not for any reason, but for some important reason for the children. For visitation, they think it's okay, but it's not. Once they have stood up and said, no more, I want it to stop, they have to follow through with that.
Okay,
Diane,
Tony?
if I could respond. The effectiveness of restraining orders are only as good as the sanity of the party that they're issued against. And whenever I represent a woman in a situation like this, the first thing I discuss with her is that if she's seen the movie Dracula, there is a scene where Dracula is about to pounce on an unsuspecting victim. Somebody pulls out a silver crucifix, and the vampire suddenly just cowers away. That does not happen with the restraining order. I tell the woman that I counsel in this area that if your husband is 6'3", 220 pounds of blue twisted steel, and you're 4'8", 120 pounds, and he comes to the house and he's in a rage, and you pull out this paper as he's coming through the front door, that paper is not going to do anything. It's not going to stop him. What it'll allow the police to do is to arrest him and charge him with further crimes, but that woman is in serious danger of her life. And I think what I caution my clients is that don't get lulled into a false sense of security because you have a restraining order. That's the beginning, not an end, and I think it's a real dangerous situation.
But Counselor, if I may, they have retained you for your services, and they are coming to you at a calm point. And when a woman is a victim of violence, a lot of times she doesn't have that ability to pay for a lawyer. Her funds are tied up. She doesn't realize what her rights are. So no one explains the system to her. She has not gone to the shelter. She is at the prosecuting attorney's office first, or she is at the police station. The police stations really don't tell her. There's a problem.
Well,
there's a problem with explaining certain things once this is obtained. Yes, you do that because you are representing this person and that's your job, and you don't want this woman calling you up in the middle of the night.
No, that's not necessarily
Well, I'm
true.
just saying, but you explain it to her as you wish you would be told. Many times they are not told those things.
I would say this. I tell her that not because I don't want to be called, because I don't want my client injured, and I don't want it to have this false sense of security. But I see it differently, at least in this area. I think there are a number of support groups that when a woman goes and takes out an application for a restraining order, immediately there is set into they're set into motion support groups that advise her exactly of what her rights are and are supportive to the point where they actually attend the hearing and provide support. Do you find that, Jackie?
I would say that we are very fortunate at Women's Resources to have that capabilities, to have someone in the courts to explain the process from beginning to end.
But you can't get everyone.
But not every courthouse in Massachusetts or across the nation has these people that are available to them. And as Susan started to say, I believe, we can't reach everyone. Sometimes courthouses are filled with hundreds of women. Maybe another day it could be just one. We can't reach them all. And when they go to the police departments in the middle of the evening, our police departments up in our area have been very cooperative with us. And we've done trainings with them, so they will go through the motions to provide the information that is necessary. So I guess I would agree with both of you that there are services out there, but they're not across.
We don't have extended families anymore. We don't have support systems. If friends and family would pay attention, would get to understand the process, would go with the woman, then I think things would be looked upon differently. I think that if we had an understanding instead of a blaming all of a sudden of the system, it's very difficult, and an order of protection is only good as its enforcement, but it's a hell of a paper trail, and it's a paper trail that could save your life.
Susan, how should a woman leave an abuser?
She should have a game plan. She shouldn't just have a few drinks. She shouldn't be talking to anybody, but thinking, sitting down and coming up with a plan step by step of how she's going to leave. In what fashion? Can she leave? Can she consult a lawyer before she does so? Because if she flees the state with her children, she can be charged with child abduction or kidnapping. She must somehow document in the state, in certain states where she's at, so that somebody knows where she's at, because he's going to go to iSearch or missing children and fill out reports that she has fled the area. And then a big investigation starts, and before everybody finds out what's going on, it may be too late, and other charges may be brought federally. She has to be very careful. She needs to know her rights. She needs to call. I think the first thing she should do is she should call in her in the phone book under women's organization. She should call a women's organization. They are free. They are confidential, to find out what her options are. She should know her rights per the law. She should know that she can go to the library, and in the library they give what a temporary restraining order means. They give information of shelters, of free legal services, legal aid, legal assistance. Those are free. You may have to be put on a waiting list, but they're free. She may not realize that if she has assets, or in the marital community property, there's assets, she just can't get to them, that a lawyer would probably take her case. If she presents it not in a hypothetical manner, in an intelligent, calm voice, more than likely the lawyers who are there for her will take her and assist her in what could be a long, heated process.
Jackie, can you offer any advice further than a restraining order to help women in this type of situation?
I think, like Susan said, they need to reach out and pick that phone up and contact organizations like the one that we offer up in Fitchburg. There are support groups, and oftentimes people are still not aware of the fact that there are groups like us, across the country that are willing to help for free. Susan said to go to the library. Some women cannot read. They don't have the capability to understand because of a different language. And different organizations can provide that assistance. We can tell them rather than having them read it in paper, on print, or if they need to speak Spanish, or if they need to speak Creole, or if they need to speak Asian. A lot of our sister agencies have that capability. So we in Fitchburg may not be able to come up with someone who speaks Khmer, but we certainly can find someone in the area.
Maybe through a church, maybe they can call an organization like this and provide flyers in the grocery stores. We're going to go to the grocery store.
We often do that too.
Laundromats. But the community needs to get involved, because they don't understand what type of programs these are. They don't realize that they are on a tight budget, that the government does not give them their monies, that they fight for every dollar just like they fight for the women and the children's lives. And it's very important to be supportive in your community of that domestic violence legal service provider.
Do you have any advice for women on how to choose a safe relationship right from the beginning?
You should watch when, how did you meet that person? How are they when you're going out with them? Let's say that you're in the restaurant and you see that he's treating the person who's waiting on the table sort of sarcastically. The car attendant, yeah, take it, buddy. Or you walk across the room, you go to a club later after dinner, and there's a bunch of friends, and he doesn't like the way those guys are looking at you. And you think it's cute because he's jealous. There's a problem that's going to escalate. Getting jealous is not cute. It's not a sign of somebody loving you. It's a sign of somebody or the things that are going to come. We should know who we date. If the person has been divorced, in the clerk's office of every county across the country, it's public record to check to see how that person was divorced. Don't take their word for it. Just go through the court document and look and see, was there an order of protection? Find out for yourself. Interview friends and neighbors. How does he treat women? Does he have a good relationship with his parents, his mother, his father? Those things are important factors. And they should be counted in when you meet somebody. I mean, like I said, you're not going to get a job with an employer unless an employer knows something about you. Why the heck would you enter into a relationship with somebody that you don't know anything about? You're not going to park in a dark alley. You're not going to stop for a stranger. We're all taught precautions. Why aren't we taught safe relationship behaviors?
Interesting. Jackie, in your experience, what % of women who have been battered return to their abusers if they've left?
Well, interestingly enough, a few years ago we did a study, and we found that the women that have come through our shelter have returned on an average of 7 times.
That's across the country, though.
Well, I recently read that it's a little bit higher out in the West Coast, but right here where we're working, it's on an average of 7 times. And some people are aghast at that. 7 times? Well, it doesn't matter if it takes, 100 times, as long as that person finally decides that that is enough. Who are we to say 7 times or 1 time or 100 times?
And in a lot of cases, battered women are losing their children because the state welfare agency is coming in and removing those children until the woman stops the relationship or the marriage.
Can we effectively, and if we can, how do we effectively help batterers?
Help batterers? Well, there are programs that exist that do try to help batterers.
But you have to be, I think you have to be able to admit that you have a problem. It's like if you're drinking too much.
Right.
You have to admit that there's a problem. I didn't gain religion or anything, but I was a very angry person. I was angry at God. I was angry at everything, everyone. I was angry at the police departments across the country. I was angry because I didn't understand a lot of things. I didn't realize that you didn't have to solve your problems with anger. And that's how we act as a country. That's how we solve things. And a batterer doesn't believe that he's done anything wrong. So the first point of order is to start teaching like you would a health ed class or an AIDS class, very early on, at the preschool level. Children not to act out what they see on television, at home, to be accountable for their behavior, that there's consequences. It's got to start earlier than that.
And we do that.
Yeah.
Up in the North Worcester County area, we have a community education department, and we are fortunate to go out into preschools and child care centers and work with the young children. Up in the Garden area, we work with first, second, and third graders for the 3rd year in a row, doing a self-esteem and a bullying and how to react, problem solve without using violence.
And it'll be interesting in the years that follow to see how effective that was. Tony?
Well, we have a batterers program here in Massachusetts that the court can order a defendant to attend, and before they attend, there has to be an assessment done as to whether or not this individual will benefit from that program.
But there's a manipulation factor as well, I think, from what I've seen, that the batterers are very clever. They're going to do whatever they need to do to get out of the program so they don't have to return at that particular point. They are good at being manipulated.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
And they have to want the assistance, otherwise you're going to continue the violence and continue it. And there's a problem across the country as to who would pay for the batterers program. Is it through license plates? Is it through other fundraising efforts? Who pays for this?
Usually the
And
defendant
those are
is audited.
questions, regrettably, we can't solve today because we're out of time. I want to thank you all very much for being here. You've been most beneficial, in my opinion. I want to give a special thank you to Diane Martin, who really assisted with a lot of the research on the show. And to our viewing audience, I want to thank you all. And until next time, take care. Thank you all.
Some people get much more food than they could ever eat. Some people get a whole lot and eat every last bite. Some people get just the right amount. Some people get way too little. Some people get even less than that. And some people get nothing at all.
Fair Foods is about sharing, and with your help, we can continue to distribute surplus food to those in need. Get involved. Call Fair Foods, 617-288-6185.